Hi folks, we're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started with tonight's event. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Noah Hurowitz presenting his new book, El Chapo, the untold story of the world's most infamous drug lord. We'll be talking with Francisco Goldman, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Noah, Francisco, and the team at Atria Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now we have just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, El Chapo, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. From Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week. And you can purchase Noah's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. Noah kindly stopped by our store this morning to sign copies of the book, so you can get a signed copy by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request in order comments at checkout when ordering online, or look for signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Francisco Goldman, author of 5 novels and 2 books of nonfiction. The Long Night of White Chickens was awarded the American Academy's Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction. His novels have been finalists for several prizes, including twice the PEN/Faulkner Prize, and his books have been published in 16 languages. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Coleman Center Fellow at the New York Public Library, and a Berlin Fellow at the American Academy. He's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Harper's, The Believer, and many other publications. He directs the Aurora Strada Prize. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Noah Hurowitz. He's a journalist based in New York City and our neighbor at Greenlight. His work has also appeared in Rolling Stone, The Village Voice, the Columbia Journalism Review, The Baffler, New York Magazine, and many more. His new book, El Chapo, is a stunning investigation of the life and legend of Mexican kingpin El Chapo, building on Noah Hurowitz's revelatory coverage for Rolling Stone of El Chapo's federal drug trafficking trial. Noah is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Francisco and with all of you. Noah, please take it away.
Hello, I'm actually going to start by running and getting my water bottle because I just realized that I don't have it. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to get a dry mouth there. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just gonna start right off with a reading. This passage starts sort of right in the middle of the saga of these twin brothers from Chicago who were sort of wholesale drug traffickers, buying huge amounts of cocaine and heroin from traffickers in Mexico linked to El Chapo and others. And in 2005, they moved down to Mexico, and it immediately went wrong. One of them was kidnapped, and eventually they were released. The brother Pedro was released on behalf of El Chapo. And so this passage starts like right before they meet El Chapo for the first time. So I'm just gonna dive right in. The first meeting the twins held together with the upper echelons of the Sinaloa Federation was with that's Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a partner of El Chapo. By now, El Mayo was well aware of these twin brothers from Chicago who, without the usual hubbub of rich young traffickers drunk on money and power, had managed to carve out a significant market share of US drug distribution, and he was eager to meet them. Did things warmly and their success. Good things, that they had moved more than 20 tons of cocaine in the several years they had been active. Not one to brag, Pedro corrected El Mayo. The real number, he pointed out, was probably somewhere between 15 and 20 tons of cocaine, he said modestly. Rising from his chair, the older man began to hold forth on his own early days slinging coke in the United States, even telling the brothers he was familiar with their neighborhood back home in Chicago. He had sold dope there too, he said, back in the day. Any one of those idiots could sell drugs in Mexico, but very few could do it in the United States like that. You guys have my respect. El Mayo told Pedro and Junior, that's Pedro's brother, he said that thing. El Mayo told Pedro and Junior, crossing the room to shake their hands. Imagine if you were triplets, he added with a laugh. Sensing an opportunity and eager to cut out unscrupulous middlemen such as Lupe, Pedro took a chance. How would you feel, he asked El Mayo, about working directly with us, no intermediaries? You know what? You guys have earned it, El Mayo said, according to Pedro. From now on, I'm going to give you the same prices as I give my top lieutenants. You guys are my people. Before getting down to business, El Mayo had one request for the brothers. I want you to go meet my compadre tomorrow, he said. It was time for Pedro and Junior to meet El Chapo. The next day, one of El Mayo's men drove Pedro and Junior out to a cornfield on the outskirts of Culiacan, where they boarded a small plane and flew about 45 minutes up into the mountains to the west of the city. They landed on a rough airstrip cut at an incline into a mountain. A small greeting party was assembled there, and the men loaded Pedro and Junior into a pickup truck to head to the boss's house. As they were driving up the mountain, Pedro glanced over his right shoulder and saw a sight that instantly told him everything he needed to know about the people he was now dealing with. By the side of the road was a man stark naked and chained to a tree. The brothers didn't have time to dwell on this chilling sight. Soon they arrived at a palapa near the crest of the mountain, and standing there, waiting for them, was El Chapo, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, and his trademark ball cap perched on his head, a pair of walkie-talkies in his hands, and a jewel-encrusted .38 caliber pistol tucked into his waistband. El Chapo said a friendly hello to the brothers, and with his observant little eyes, took in the two Americans who were dressed in jean shorts and decked out with gold chains. With all that money, you can't afford the rest of the pants, El Chapo quipped about the jean shorts. The only thing you're missing is a dress. Pedro had brought as a gift a pair of gold-plated .50 caliber Desert Eagles, the monstrous pistols often seen in the hand of John Rambo and countless other action heroes. They weren't the most practical weapons, however, weighing nearly 5 pounds apiece, and Pedro could tell immediately from El Chapo's reaction that he thought the guns to be silly. I guess I was watching too many movies, big old heavy handguns, Pedro recalled later. It was not, it wasn't something they would use. After some more pleasantries, the three men took a seat under the palapa while a small army of about 40 armed guards prowled the perimeter. An AK-47 was propped up against the drug lord's chair. Despite his relaxed demeanor, he seemed ready for anything. I'm just going to skip some stuff that you guys don't really know about because you haven't read this part. Before the brothers left, El Chapo had another question for them. Could they read English, he asked. They could. Gesturing to one of his men to bring a sheet of paper, El Chapo asked them to take a look at a printed out copy of a news article about a drug bust that had happened a few months earlier. He wanted to know if they thought it was real or if the trafficker whose men had gotten caught and whose cocaine had been confiscated had cooked up an excuse. Taking a glance at the article, Pedro thought that it looked too simply written to be real. Man, this looks like anybody could type this up, Pedro told El Chapo. The drug lord turned to one of his men. Execute him, he said. Someone was going to die because of what Pedro had told the boss, and this didn't sit well with him. Later, when they were back in Culiacan, Pedro went down to the business center of their hotel and looked up the seizure on the internet. Sure enough, there were accounts of the bust in several newspapers. Pedro was horrified. He didn't want anyone to die because of this snap judgment of the printout. He immediately got on the phone with his main contact, El Chapo, and explained to him that the story was in fact real. I was worried that someone might get hurt over a simple mistake, he recalled later. The twins never found out the fate of the man whom El Chapo had suspected of lying, but they did find out what happened to Lupe, the former connect who they had gotten sort of in trouble with. When El Chapo learned of the way in which Lupe had double-crossed the twins, he ordered a hitman to kidnap Lupe and his sons, only releasing the sons when Lupe agreed under duress to sign over a number of properties to El Chapo in order to pay his ransom. When the sons reneged and went to the police, the hitman told Pedro that he smothered Lupe to death. I'm sorry, it's gonna get kind of violent here. It already did. Smothered Lupe to death with a plastic bag before tracking down and murdering the sons for going to the cops. Even after hearing this grim news, however, Pedro was still feeling paranoid. Some months after his kidnapping, the twins' father had joined them in Mexico, mentioned a rumor that Lupe had been seen. This worried Pedro, and he mentioned his concern to El Chapo, telling the boss that Lupe still posed a threat. You are seeing ghosts, El Chapo replied. Worry about something else. The twins were not so worried as to stop working. Despite their supposed aversion to violence, despite the rough start in Mexico, Pedro and Junior launched themselves into their work with their typical mix of discretion and logistical prowess, and it paid off. On the first shipment alone, a load of 500 kilos of coke delivered by El Chapo and El Mayo to Chicago and distributed to their workers from there, the twins made more than $1.5 million overseeing the operation from Mexico. By the fourth time he met with El Chapo at the boss's mountain hideout, Pedro was getting used to the routine. As always, he came bearing gifts, which this visit included a pair of jean shorts, a jokey nod to El Chapo's comment about Pedro's fashion choice on the first visit. El Chapo received the shorts, delivered in a box with the Viagra logo, with a chuckle. During a chat with the boss after arriving, Pedro told El Chapo about how nervous he had been on that first visit, how he hadn't known quite what to expect. I said I had this idea, like the movies, that you had lines of people and guys would shoot them in the head and say, next, Pedro recalled. Everybody laughed at that, including El Chapo, but then his demeanor changed. Only the ones we have to, El Chapo said.
That's a great section to read. Congratulations on the book. I just want to say, first of all, El Chapo, I think it's such a terrific read, this book, and it's so comprehensive. And I just love the way you use El Chapo and the story of El Chapo and the character of El Chapo and his particular circle, his cartel, if you will, to tell the story of especially the late 20th century development into the 21st century of what we now call the narco war, and this big leap in money and power and reach and strength of the narco cartels that we've seen here in Mexico. And of course, El Chapo is the emblematic figure in all this. Your book captures exactly why, right? People are so transfixed by him. And also, as in your reading, I think, as the book does also, well, you do get some sense of the pop star of Chapo, because he was a pop star, like it or not. And a lot of us hate to even hear him talked about in that way. We live here in Mexico. You do not hide what a ruthless, murderous psycho he really is, right? However much he justifies it as a business, right? He's a psychotic murderer. But so having read the book, I see that. But what about you, right? You were writing for Rolling Stone. You didn't have a lot of experience in Mexico. What drew you to this? What made you dive into the subject of El Chapo and produce this book? What drew you to him?
Well, as you said, sort of, I got my start covering El Chapo pretty much at the start of his criminal trial in Brooklyn in November of 2018, and I was offered this essentially a freelance gig, and I jumped at it because, I mean, it's been called like the trial of the century. There's lots of trials of the century, but this was a trial of a century. And I knew that it was going to be just this really sort of, I knew that even if I just covered the trial, it would be really interesting and would be a really sort of, comprehensive learning experience to understand this world. At the time, I was doing more, domestic drug policy in the United States. But I had always been interested in Latin America. I spent some time living in Peru. I spoke decent Spanish. And so this seemed like a really good entry point. And when I was figuring out when I was at the beginning of this process of, writing a book proposal and I thought long and hard about whether the world needed another book about El Chapo, or it needed any more sort of cultural production about El Chapo. And one answer to that is, maybe not, right? There's so much out there. There's so much information about him, but so much of the information is based on myth and based on sort of incorrect understandings of how the drug trade works in Mexico. And so what I saw, in the end was this really famous and sort of infamous character who has captured the public imagination. That to me is a really sort of powerful entry point to explaining this larger structure of the war on drugs and sort of the situation of the way that the drug trade works in Mexico. So my goal from the beginning, was to use this story of El Chapo and to tell the story of El Chapo and to follow it, because it is extremely interesting. He lived a crazy life. And so just from a pure journalistic perspective, that story is interesting to tell and interesting to read. But it also tells us so much about the development, as you said, of the drug trade in the late 20th century into the early 21st century. And if you look at sort of the period in which El Chapo's life and career occurred, you see that, there's so much talk about El Chapo being this kind of like, singular genius. I was asked earlier today, how much of an impact I thought he had on the drug trade with his innovations and his, the way he structured his so-called cartel. And but honestly, I think it's the other way around. I think El Chapo is a product of a certain time and place. I'm not saying that he's a victim of society necessarily, obviously, but he's a product of a time and place. And so what you from the beginning of his career in the drug trade, El Chapo is from this tiny little village called La Tuna in this, so I guess the equivalent would be like a county called Badiraguato in the mountains of Sinaloa. And it's at least a 3-4 hour drive now from the capital city of Sinaloa, Culiacan. I'm sure when he was a child, it was considerably longer than that. So he's from this very remote little place. And so, first of all, the place he's from has an effect on how he developed. And it was a center of the drug trade in Mexico. I'm just going to close this because it's sorry.
You're going to steam the, yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to start getting all this flop sweat. So that's the place. Sinaloa, rugged, rural area, in many ways is very much under the control of Mexican government. I'm not saying necessarily that it's like, under the control of the cartels, because I think that is often overstated. But what it was it was the presence of the state was very limited. And when it did arrive, when the state did arrive, it was usually in the form of some kind of military incursion, some sort of brutal crackdown that fell mostly on poor peasants, which at the time included El Chapo, And so we see this changing, shifting drug trade in the late 60s with sort of the hippie boom of the arrival, this huge rise in demand for marijuana. And in the 70s, the main route for heroin into the United States was shut down. And so suddenly the opium fields that already existed in Sinaloa exploded in size. There was a huge new demand for opium, because when you shut down one drug production center, the demand for that drug doesn't go away, it just shifts somewhere else. In this case, it shifted to Sinaloa. And so when El Chapo was coming into his own as a trafficker, the drug trade there was just growing and growing. And again in the 80s with the advent of cocaine, in the 90s with sort of the rise of neoliberal free trade and this sort of new post-Cold War consensus, again, the drug trade shifted and it began to become more militarized, right? The military in the US had this massive budget at the end of the Cold War. And literally, they needed an excuse to use it. Like, that's not a conspiracy, That's like, there's a quote in the book from this guy at the time, this general, who said we were looking around for how to justify our forces. So again and again, we see in this time period, El Chapo's story being affected by these larger structures.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. I want to get to the Mexican government, official Mexico's involvement in the drug trade, the US's role in this horrible, horrible disaster. But I want to think of just Chapo, the man, right? Because even you look at the Sinaloa Cartel, right? Most people, at least in Mexico, tend to credit El Mayo as the really crafty, indispensable leader, right? Which has been proven. Because Chapo's gone and Sinaloa Cartel continues, but Chapo drew all the attention. You could tell that, this is a book about El Chapo, and you do such a great job of bringing him alive, of showing us his character, of telling us who he is. That must have been something you discovered as you were writing, right? Because you couldn't have known that beforehand. And tell us about your own sense of what makes, why did he become such a charismatic figure in the popular imagination? What is it about him? Who is this man? How would you describe him as a man?
That's a really good question. I think, he's a guy from Sinaloa, he's like got a kind of like rural, like almost cowboy attitude. He's from everything that I've been told, either directly by people who knew him, and also from testimony at trial. He wasn't this sort of screaming, scary narco boss. I'm sure he might have been that for some people. But in general, the impression I got of El Chapo when he was dealing with people personally was that he was a pretty I wouldn't say laid back, because he could definitely be sort of a control freak and want sort of control over all aspects of the operation. He was a micromanager, but you know, he liked to like he liked to kick it. You know, he liked to like chit chat, and he would call you like, you know, dude, like, hey, chavalon, like, you know, he would crack jokes. You know, as I think as we see in the passage that I read from, he could be a personable guy, and I think that's part of his charisma. And you know, and I saw that personally. You know, as I was very lucky to cover the trial prior to writing this book, because unlike, you know, unlike the vast majority of journalists who maybe deserve to have, you know, seen him in person more than I did, I was able to observe him. You know, I was sitting 20 feet away from him every day for 3 months, and he was very alert. You know, he would, I think Kirkus dinged me a little bit for mentioning his beady little eyes too many times. That was the one negative. You know how in every book review they need to find a negative thing? That was their one thing. But he has these beady little eyes, and he just watches everything, you know, including
everything. Sure.
He look back at us. And so I think he was very sort of, you know, very alert, very, you know, personable. Like you said, he had this great charisma, and I think he inspired loyalty among people. And I found that when I went to Sinaloa, you know, people I talked to, obviously the stuff that they told me as a gringo journalist, there's a certain amount of like PR, you know, but a lot of the people who I spoke to in Sinaloa, who had come in contact with him or who knew him, were very fond of him.
Yeah. You think he was a good reader of other people, that his insights into other people made him somebody who knew how to manipulate other people?
I do. I think that has to be sort of, I mean, that's any good manager is good is good at manipulating people, right? And you know, I think he was, you know, he knew when to, he was not afraid to exploit people. You know, we saw at trial, there was you know, there was all of this electronic surveillance, like evidence from electronic surveillance entered, including, you know, text messages that he had been sending. And he at one point he sent his girlfriend up into the mountains to buy marijuana, and he you know, told her basically to like kind of rip people off, you know. And so I think that sort of gives us a little bit of information about how, you know, he was a very shrewd businessman.
And one more question about him, because you get like, okay, so he you know, he has this thing for women. He's even a sentimental father, maybe even a loving father. But Noah, he killed so many people. Your book just touches the tip of the iceberg, the number of people he killed.
Yeah.
Was there any remorse in him? Was he a cold killer? Did he give a darn about killing anybody?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that he did. I think that he was not. He honestly, like, we heard, like, at trial we heard examples, and I've read of other examples where he wasn't necessarily killing everyone who pissed him off. You know, he wasn't this like psychotic sort of like, you know, if you make one little mistake, you're dead. But I can't necessarily speak to how willing he was personally to kill people, but I think that he was more than willing to give orders that would lead to tremendous amounts of death and violence and misery. And I think that's where we get into, you know, how responsible is he for violence in Mexico? And a lot. I think whenever he would sort of push to control a new territory, that would result in a tremendous amount of loss of life by, you know, both, you know, organized criminals, but also by innocent people. And he was, you know, he or people who were working for him were willing to disappear people, you know, commit essentially a war crime, a crime against humanity. And you know, I've thought a lot about how to reconcile the contradictions, or what appear to be contradictions, with this sort of, as you said, you know, he could be a doting father. He could be a friendly guy. He could be at times a attentive husband at times. I think he probably wasn't the best husband. But and at the same time, he has a tremendous amount of blood on his hands. But ultimately, I don't think that that's necessarily as much of a contradiction as we might think it is, you know, and because ultimately he was involved at a very high executive level in an inherently violent and bloody business in a country where that business and really all capitalist enterprises have this really nasty, bloody, corrupt side to them. And I began to think of him almost as I would, you know, an executive of ExxonMobil or an executive of like, you know, Nestle or something that has, you know, that they give orders that down the line result in tremendous loss of life or destruction of environmental areas or natural habitats. And I think they sleep fine at night, and they kiss their children goodnight as well. And so I think that ultimately, I have no interest in letting Chapo off the hook, you know, but because to me, comparing him to a Chevron executive is not letting him off the hook. It is just making clear that you know, his violence is just noticeable to us because he's involved in an illegal enterprise that has a much more violent public face, you know. Yeah. And so, but ultimately, I think that you know, I think that he made a lot of excuses. I think he you know, he had this sort of thought of if it's not me, it'll be someone else, and that's true. But that doesn't mean you have to do it.
He was also pretty diabolical in some of the ways he came up to sort of create his Sicario armies, which were kind of his slave armies. But that aside, let's go to the state, right? You open in the trial, you mention, and this is the first part of this question. You talk about, like, at one point it's revealed during the trial that President Peña Nieto had accepted $100 million bribe from El Chapo. That sounds like a lot. Nobody was surprised by that here.
Right.
Everybody here knew that this guy Peña Nieto was probably the most corrupt president Mexico had yet had, right. and that government was the most corrupt, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'll say.
And you go back and you begin with the rise of El Chapo, and you show how from the ground up, so much of it is about buying off officials, buying off police. The building of a narco network goes hand in hand with corrupting the state. You really show that splendidly in the book, right? So talk a little bit about what you discovered and explain a bit, what is the role of the Mexican state, at least up through the last pre-government time, because this new government has been a little bit different than its approach to that, at least, right? So,
and I'll say, if anyone wants to really understand sort of the rise of Enrique Peña Nieto, I recommend Mr. Goldman's book, The Interior Circuit, which has a really good sort of depiction of the 2012 election of Peña Nieto. Look, I opened the book with this sort of a trip to this site in Culiacan, this shrine to a this sort of legendary, like, bandit saint, like a Robin Hood figure of Mexico, who has become sort of almost like a patron saint of migrants and drug traffickers. And there's a lot of comparisons between El Chapo and Malverde, right? But what I sort of, you know, without spoiling too much, I don't think of El Chapo as a Malverde, because I don't see him as in in direct conflict or in opposition to the state. I see him as a part of the sort of like
part of the state,
part of this sort of this gray black area of power that the state negotiates with to exert power. You know, drug traffickers in Mexico have always had a very you know, directly cozy relationship with elements of the state. It's a little bit, it might be a little bit less in the open than it used to be, but it's, you know, drug traffickers can't operate without corruption, and I think it's an error to see the story of the drug trade and the war on drugs as this kind of like, state versus drug trafficker, because that's just not how it is. And in Sinaloa particularly, the historian Benjamin Smith has written really brilliantly about this, about how in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the profits of the drug trade actually provided for a tremendous amount of stability in Sinaloa, a stability that the PRI, the ruling party in Mexico City, relied on. And so the drug trade was this essentially like a pillar of support for the regime that kept peasants pacified with slightly higher wages, so they were less likely to start little guerrilla armies like they were doing in other states, or advocate for land reform, because they were making enough money by growing opium, right? And so there was this very sort of symbiotic relationship between drug traffickers and the state that carried like on in one form or another until, it started to break down in sort of the early 90s, right? And this is not to say that it's gone. It isn't gone. It's just that it used to be more hegemonic. There used to be much more clear lines of communication and cooperation between drug traffickers and the state. But as the PRI lost power, that began, drug traffickers had to negotiate new pacts, new negotiations with local officials, and you started to see more violence in those areas. In areas along the border in northern Mexico, where the PAN, the center-right party that took power in 2000, as they started to win local elections, there started to be more violence in those areas, because these very sort of set in stone, or not set in stone, but these sort of long existing and long, always renegotiated, but long existing agreements were starting to break down, and they needed to cooperate with new officials. And so, it's very clear that drug traffickers like El Chapo had constant communication with elements of the state, and were allowed to move drugs in exchange for bribes, but not only bribes. It's not just an envelope or a briefcase full of cash, because they also provided a certain service to the state. And I think that that's sort of one of the things that I really wanted to explore in the book.
Yeah, nobody doubts in Mexico that the narcos in the state are like this. The Ayotzinapa crime, which is probably the thing that most played the biggest role in bringing down the PRI kind of once and for all in the 2018 elections. That was a crime of state. The army, the state, intertwined with drug traffickers who were trafficking heroin up to Chicago. So it takes us to the other part of it, right? The even bigger player in this narco tragedy, in this incredible historical tragedy, which Mexico is now living, and to some degree, vulnerable people in the U.S. also live, right, is the United States. Right, and it's really simple, right? They buy most of the drugs, right, and they supply all the arms to both sides,
right?
So how can anyone in the United States ever even score in Mexico,
right,
for its role in this? This is a product of the United States, isn't it?
Yes, I'm glad that you say that, because I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that I'm just talking about how corrupt and screwed up Mexico is, because it is. But the U.S. has a extremely culpable role in that screwed upness and in that corruption and violence, and it goes beyond, honestly. It goes beyond the sort of the demand for drugs in the United States. And it goes even beyond the supply of weapons coming from the United States to Mexico. Those are both important, particularly, I think, the weapons, because in 2004 the assault weapon ban expired, and immediately Mexico was flooded with assault weapons, and pretty soon after the murder rate went through the roof, right? For many reasons, but it was more often that these AKs and AR-15s were being used in crimes. But it goes beyond that, sort of those, like the arms manufacturers and drug users. It's a function of U.S. foreign policy. you know? Mexico had a brief experimentation with legalizing drugs in the 40s. I think there's this great historian, Furlan Enciso. He also works in human rights.
I know Furlan, yeah.
He's written about this experiment under the government of Lázaro Cárdenas to legalize drugs. And you know who nipped that in the bud? The US. You know, what would have happened if, you know, if that had been allowed to continue? My guess, honestly, is that if drugs had been legalized in Mexico, it would have followed the same sort of like corrupt oligarchical capitalist trajectory that all capitalism in Mexico follows. It wouldn't have been great, but it would have been better than this. And in the 70s, you know, the US pushed really hard. The Nixon administration pushed really hard on Mexico City to sort of fight drug trafficking in Mexico. And I say fight because I genuinely don't think that the war on drugs has ever really been about drugs. It's always been an excuse. You know, the Nixon administration declared the war on drugs in the United States as a method of controlling and punishing poor communities, particularly poor communities of color, Black neighborhoods. And in foreign policy, the war on drugs is a really useful tool to force foreign governments, particularly in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, to comply with other aspects of U.S. foreign policy. And one thing that we see, you know, later on in the 80s, the U.S. passed this law in which any nation that wants to get U.S. aid needs to meet what's called a certification of its anti-drug efforts. And if you don't do enough, you know, anti-drug work, you're not going to get any foreign aid from the United States. And so there's this very powerful tool to force governments to toe, you know, to stay in line with United States foreign policy. And the other clue that we have that it's not really about drugs is that the US only really brings this up with governments that it's opposed to, you know? The State Department and the DOJ are sort of constantly harping on the alleged corruption of government officials in Venezuela, which is true. I think that, you know, there are military and police officials in Venezuela very connected with the drug trade. But they talk a lot less about Honduras, where the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, is, you know, he played a key role in the Trump administration's efforts to keep migrants from coming north to the border. Yeah. And as a result, you know, even while the Department of Justice was indicting and prosecuting the president of Honduras's brother and other officials very close to him for explicit involvement in the drug trade, you didn't hear a lot of, you know, talk about Hernandez being involved in the drug trade. You know, literally there would be tweets from the State Department or whoever about the efforts of Hernandez in helping fight the drug trade.
Yeah, it was even worse with the Guatemalan government.
Exactly.
Trump went in and utterly dismantled their anti-narco, anti-corruption justice forces. Right. You know, let's get to like the story you tell here. I found this story so exciting, the way you narrate it, and yet it began to just appall me, right? Here you go, you see all these years, the United States, the DEA, governments, putting so much money, so much expertise, so many boots on the ground, skilled agents, right? All focused on bringing down El Chapo. And by the time I got to the end of it, it seemed to me the most wasteful, absurd effort I could imagine, right? Why elevate this man as a target, right? And everybody, it's in Mexico, everyone's collaborating in the myth of this great outlaw that has to be brought down. And as we've seen since he fell, the narco war only got worse. The various new cartels, like first Las Zetas, down Nueva Generación, which is going around the country in tanks, have only gotten more militarized, right? More ruthless, more entrenched, more outside any kind of, it seems, even corrupt Mexican government control right now. what was it all for?
Yeah. I
And
mean,
that's just, why that strategy? It's clearly a dumb strategy.
it's mind numbing. It's just, it makes me so angry. And, but by the end of writing this book, I was so bitter and, tired and angry. And I don't even, live in Mexico. That's just my professional sort of exposure to this, but it drives you kind of nuts, like what you're referring to, of course, is this sort of kingpin strategy, right? Of this going after the high ranking leaders of so-called drug cartels. And
especially him.
especially him. And I'm saying El Chapo is sort of the crown jewel of the kingpin strategy.
Yeah.
And we see again and again that the only thing that results from arresting these high ranking narcos who, they deserve bad things to happen to them, honestly. I'm not mad about them, them being arrested or whatever. But the only thing that happens is that the people under them fracture into smaller groups and they compete with one another. And sometimes they fracture so much that they don't even have the operational capacity to traffic drugs in the same way that they used to. And so they turn inward. They turn in on the communities that they're operating in. Under El Chapo, say what you will about him, but until 2008, when he sort of had a schism in his organization, he did not inflict that much violence on Sinaloa. And I think that's part of why he's popular there still. He did elsewhere, but he knew he needed that base of support, and he knew he could just make money moving drugs to the United States. But increasingly, you see these smaller groups cannibalizing their own communities, extorting, kidnapping.
Well, that's everywhere. Zetas are big.
Yeah, and that's a result. That's a direct result of this utterly failed strategy to disrupt the drug trade by lopping off the heads of the organizations. And it's
meanwhile, some of the old cartels are as strong as ever, like the Gulf Cartel seems as strong as ever. Sinaloa is still strong. Nueva Generación seems to me the most terrifying group we've seen yet.
Yeah.
It's just, where does it stop? What can be done? It's
a strategic and moral catastrophe.
Yeah.
This continued effort is a strategic and moral catastrophe, and it's unconscionable. And our government in the United States is responsible for it. You asked, what can be done? It's really, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I don't have a great answer.
Nobody does.
Yeah. Nobody does, and people who have spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have don't have a good answer.
A very smart journalist I heard the other day. He runs Sin Embargo, one of the best digital news site. And he said, when he recently read a book about how the U.S. managed to, and other countries managed to finally defeat Islamic State. Mm-hmm. It struck him that you need to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think I understand the desire in Mexico for a sort of overpowering, like forceful response, but all that gets us is like what we saw in Ciudad Juarez.
People really don't want that because they think it's just civilians that will die, and that it's going to. Yeah, it's nobody. People just don't know what.
But I guess the sort of long term answer is there needs to be a hopefully not too gradual, but it will be gradual because these things take time, strengthening of institutions, strengthening of the justice system in Mexico, strengthening of honest policing, but on Mexican terms, not on US terms. I don't think that Mexico City should. I think that I recommend a complete non-intervention from the US. I think that they should not have the DEA in Mexico anymore. I think that they should let Mexico City do what it wants to do. And I think that will also require Mexico City to take seriously things that they haven't before, like strengthening the justice system, strengthening this crisis of impunity.
And most of all, fighting economic inequality.
Yes. So that fewer people see the drug trade as the only option to make a living. And yeah, I don't have a great answer. I will, though, to transition, hopefully have better answers for our attendees if they have any questions.
Excellent, excellent.
Beautiful transition. Reminder, folks, if you do have any questions for Noah, you can put those in the Q&A module. That's the icon at the bottom of your Zoom window with 2 speech bubbles. We have a question here from Max. It says, El Chapo's defense in the trial wanted to convince the jury that El Mayo was the real boss. How true was this, and how is the cartel operating these days without El Chapo?
Great question. And you know, great recollection from the trial. El Mayo is his real name is Ismael Zambada Garcia, and he was a longtime partner of El Chapo. They worked very closely together for many years, and in many ways he's sort of like, you know, he keeps his head down. He's content to sort of stay in the mountains. He's given one interview back in like 2010. He spoke to Proceso, but you know, he just has always commanded less attention than El Chapo. But I think he's probably always had more power. You know, I think he had a more sort of calm relationship with the state and with the areas in which he operated. And you know, now, so I went to Sinaloa 4 times in 2019. I made 4 sort of extended trips there, and people would talk about, you know, they would always refer to Sinaloa as like it's controlled, está controlado, and what they meant was that people knew who was in charge, you know, and this is after El Chapo's gone. In other areas of Mexico, when they've sort of lopped off the head of a criminal organization, it's resulted in a lot of chaos. And there has been a little bit of infighting in Sinaloa in the years since he was arrested. But many people see Sinaloa as still very controlled by El Mayo. You know, his presence is very sort of, you know, whispered about and felt. And I think part of that is psychological. You know, I don't know how much direct control he has on a given street corner or whatever, but I think, you know, he has this sort of, you know, his own myth, right, of this sort of very taciturn, sort of serious and sober, you know, leader who demands a certain level of quiet in his home state. And you know, I think that you know, the what we refer to as the Sinaloa Cartel, which is really various factions of drug traffickers who work together. It's still very powerful in Sinaloa. You know, it's still very. I mean, we saw that in October of 2019 when the National Guard tried to arrest one of El Chapo's sons, Ovidio, and within minutes there were hundreds of gunmen on the street burning buses and, you know, making roadblocks and just outright fighting the army and the National Guard, and they forced the release of Chapo's son, Ovidio. And so with that, you know, I think that showed us that organized crime and drug trafficking networks in Sinaloa remain very powerful, and their presence is felt everywhere.
We have a question here from James, who first says great discussion, and then asks what might be the emerging impacts of the climate crisis with the issue of the so-called war on drugs and the wealth disparity both in Mexico and the US.
That's a great question. You know, environmental justice and the ability to live a dignified life is at the root of you know, so many issues in rural areas of Mexico. You know, drought has a very severe effect on you know, these mountains where drugs are grown. Now, I think that we're going to see more people moving around. I think we're going to see more sort of population shifts as since around 2000. In 2014, drug traffickers in Mexico started introducing fentanyl, this powerful synthetic opioid, into heroin and fake pressed like pills, fake OxyContin that they were shipping to the United States. And as a result, the price of opium crashed, and so people who were previously relying on opium crops in the mountains could no longer make a living, and more they're moving to sort of the outskirts of Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa. And actually, on one of my trips to Culiacan, I went out to the outskirts there to there's this big garbage dump. And right next to the garbage dump, there's all of these sort of shanty towns of people who have been displaced from the mountains, either by drought or by the crash of opium prices or by violence in the mountains. And that is a recipe for disaster. And I think that is also going to increasingly happen with climate change. We're going to see more drought, we're going to see more heat, and the more people are displaced and the more people gather on the outskirts of the city with few resources and not a lot of jobs, there's going to be more violence. We saw that in Ciudad Juarez, where the rise of these factories known as maquiladoras led to this rapid expansion on the outskirts of the city with very little social infrastructure, few playgrounds, few parks. And so kids growing up there, they don't have a lot to do, and they don't have anywhere to play. And they become ripe targets for organized crime, basically to be cannon fodder. And so I think, as with many developed, sort of underdeveloped areas, in North Africa and in the Middle East, we see these sort of dispossessed young men being drawn to terrorism, drawn to the Islamic State. And in Mexico, in Latin America, I think that the more people are displaced by climate crisis, the more we're going to see just sort of, vulnerable young men being drawn into violence.
Thank you for that. See, Max asks, we have time for one last question here. This was the first time you did this kind of crisis zone reporting. Can you talk about some of the lessons you learned from being thrown into these high intensity situations?
That's a great question. When I first went to Sinaloa in April of 2019, I had never done this kind of reporting. I was a local reporter from New York City, working in New York City, and I was asked a lot, like, how did I feel? Did I feel safe? Whatever. And the first thing I'll say is that I never faced the same level of threat that Mexican journalists face in Mexico. Mexico is one of the deadliest places to be a journalist. At least a dozen, maybe 24 journalists have been killed just since I started working on this book. And I want to say I never faced that level of threat there. I think that, I had a lot of privilege as a gringo. And part of that privilege was that I think, organized crime in Sinaloa knows that the consequences of harming a North American would be very severe, or they think that. I want them to think that. But so, when I first went, the first thing I did was I called up this guy who's now a good friend of mine, Jan Albert Hutzen, who is the representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists in Mexico. And I spoke to him about, what the threat level is, like what the situation is right now. How do I look over my shoulder? And he ended up being very, every time I would go to Sinaloa, Jan Albert I would text him in the morning, and I would text him in the evening to say, hey, I'm okay. And sometimes I would say, hey, I'm going to this prison to do an interview, or I'm going up into the mountains. I'm not going to have cell service, but I'll text you when I'm back in the city. I took my safety very seriously, because even though I felt that I was more protected than, certainly than Mexican journalists who work really bravely under incredible threat, I still took it very seriously. No story, this is sort of a cliche, but no story is worth your life. And I was, I didn't want to hurt my family, and I didn't want to become some kind of pawn in like an international incident that the Trump administration, or now the Biden administration, could use to sort of, pressure Mexico or do, that I would have lost control of my own sort of narrative there. And that would be bad for Mexico and Mexicans. And I also, the other thing that I took very seriously, I worked pretty closely in Sinaloa for a lot of my reporting, not all of it, but much of it, with a local journalist who worked as sort of a fixer. His name is Miguel Angel Vega. He's a great reporter, great fixer. And he helped me set up interviews, and I was always very cognizant of the fact that I couldn't do anything that would put him in harm's way. At the time, I had to act like I belonged there. I had to act like serious, and I couldn't, take stupid risks that would put him in danger. And then after, in writing the book, I had to weigh very carefully some of the quotes I got, and I had to, anonymize some of the people who spoke with me, because I didn't want to write anything that could get them in trouble or hurt. And so, yes, it was sort of a trial by fire, but I approached it cautiously and with a great deal of prior research, and just taking it very, very seriously. And that would be my advice to any reporter who wants to do work anything like this, is just to do your research, talk to locals, local journalists, talk to, if you're going to Mexico, talk to Jan Albert, and just take it very seriously, because it's not, it's no joke. It's no joke. It's no joke. Your safety is no joke, and the consequences of your actions for the people who you're coming into contact with in Mexico is no joke. And just, you have to be very careful, and very not to the point of being sort of quaking in your boots necessarily, but you have to be very aware of your surroundings and aware of the implications of what you're doing and what you're saying, and later what you write.
Thank you so much, Noah and Francisco, for tonight's fantastic conversation. And thank all of you for coming here and sharing this space for conversation and connection with us. A reminder that you can buy El Chapo from Greenlight bookstore, and that we have signed copies. You can stop by the store. We're open noon to 7 p.m. if you're local to Brooklyn to find those, or you can order online. I just put that buy link back in the chat. And just make sure that you request a signed copy and order comments at checkout if you're ordering online. Thank you so much again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congrats, Noah.
Okay.